Okay, great. So once again, good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me back. Thank you for inviting me back. Pleasure to be here as always. Um, Wanted to talk about a topic which doesn't really have much to do with this week's parsha. However, I just wanted to start with an idea relating to this week's parsha and then move on to the topic. And that is, of course, we know the famous story of Parshat Shalach Lecha, when the spies go out to. Well, they're not really going on a covert mission. They're not, CIA agents or MI6, I guess it would be if it's outside of your territory. But they're going on kind of a reconnaissance mission to check out the land. And the question is two questions really. Number one, what did they do and why did they do it? I guess those are really two questions to you see any portion in the Torah like this. And there's so much to say, but I'm not going to focus on that today. I just wanted to share something which I think is an important message, and that is the very first Rashi in this week's parsha says the following. It says, and he's quoting the Medrash and comments on the juxtaposition between the very final episode of last week's parsha and the story of the spies. Last week's parsha, Ba'alotcha, ends off with the story of Miriam speaking negatively about Moshe, about Miriam speaking in Lashon Hara, her brother Aaron about Moshe, and immediately the Torah continues and talks about the story of the spies. And the Medrash comments on this and says it's no coincidence those two are put together. And it says the following: it says, why did the Torah place them together? Well, the spies saw what happened to Miriam when she spoke negatively about her brother. And these Rishaim Halalu, these people, saw what happened. And they did not take heed. They didn't learn the lesson. They saw what happened to Miriam after she spoke Lashon Hara. They saw the punishment that she got, and they didn't take that on board. They didn't learn the lesson. What you see from it, first of all, is that there's a lot of talk around what they did wrong. The Medrash, at least, is commenting on the fact that what they did wrong was the fact that they spoke negatively about the land. And what's fascinating about this is that we don't tend to think of Lashon Hara as being something which is relating to a non-human being, to an inanimate thing such as a piece of land. We think of Lashon Hara as being something which is affecting other people. We don't speak negatively about people because we don't want to hurt them. We don't want to cause damage to them. What does Lashon Hara have to do with a piece of land? And something which I learned from one of my Rabbi, Rabbi Berkowitz, was that actually we have to look at what the root of Lashon Hara really is. What is the issue with speaking negatively? Yes, of course, there is damage that we cause to people, but essentially the wrongdoing of Lashon Hara is not so much about what we do to others, but more about who we are ourselves. It's not so much about the damage we cause to others, but more about what it says about who we are. And he gives a story which is, I believe, the stories in the Gemara about the one of the Tanaim, one of the great rabbis, who's walking down the street with his talmidim, with his students, and they come across a carcass, dead animals, been lying there for a few days. As you can imagine, it smells bad, it's decaying, there's a lot of flies, it's not a very pleasant sight. The students, as probably what we would have done, kind of, walk around the animal and comment on how disgusting that animal is. Like, oh, that's disgusting. And he turns to his students and he says, but look how beautiful and white its teeth are. Comments and says, look how beautiful and white this animal's teeth are. And what he was trying to teach the students was, of course, whenever we go through life, there are always things which we can look at and see in a negative way. We can always see negativity if we focus. However, there's always going to be something positive which you can focus on as well. There's always going to be something which we can see, which we can find a positive message from as well. And therefore, when he was teaching them, when you see that dead carcass, don't focus on how disgusting it is, but find the goodness over there. See how beautiful, white, and shiny its teeth are. And Robertus would say the same is true about Lashon Hara. Essentially, it's a mitzvah not between us and other people, between us and ourselves. And that is, see the world in a positive way. Don't be naive. Don't just, think everything's all airy-fairy, but don't focus. Don't get sucked into the negativity. And essentially, that was the mistake the spies made. They got sucked into the negativity. They had a negative perspective And they saw negativity because of the negative perspective. And therefore, perhaps one can understand the Rashi in this week's parasha to be saying they saw what happened to Miriam, they saw the Lashon Hara that she spoke, and they saw what happened to her, and they did not take the lesson on board. What do you mean they didn't take the lesson on board? Anyone in this room could have seen what have happened to Miriam and learned the lesson. It wasn't a difficult lesson to be learned. I mean, you saw that she spoke negatively about Moshe and she gets punished for it. I mean, you're talking about great people over here. What message did they miss? What was the lesson that they missed? Well, perhaps the lesson they missed was they missed what Lashon Hara really is. It's not just speaking about people. It's speaking negatively in general. It's speaking negative, being a negative individual and a negative human being. That is the root of Lashon Hara. And they saw perhaps Lashon Hara as being something which is between human beings to other human beings. You know, that's why Miriam got punished. Because she spoke negatively about her brother. She hurt his feelings. No. The problem with Lashon Hara has nothing to do with speaking about other people per se. It's about negativity in general, about seeing the world in a negative way. And that is the lesson which they failed to see when it came to Miriam. So just wanted to share that idea with everyone as we start. But essentially, what I wanted to talk about, this is an interesting topic, is the topic of Torah. What did Moshe Rabbeinu receive on Har Sinai? What is the Torah that we talk about when we say that Moshe transmits the Torah to Yeshua and to the transmission of Torah? And you'll see there are a few different sources over here, but it might be nice for us to, think about them ourselves and see what we can learn from here, because this is really a fundamental topic. And the first one is the Gemara in Brachot, a very famous Gemara. And the Gemara says, quoting the pasuk in Mishpatim, pasuk in Mishpatim says the following: Vayomer Hashem al Moshe. Hashem says to Moshe, Alei Elai Hahara, come to me, come up on the mountain. V'heyei sham, and I'll be there. V'etnachal, I'll give to you. So Hashem says to Moshe, this is what I'm going to give to you, and he lists 5 things: Luchot Even, he gave you the tablets of stone. Torah, mitzvah, asher kasavti, which I have written, lahoratam, to teach them. 5 things over here. I'll give you tablets of stone, the Torah, mitzvah, asher kasavti, that which I have written, lahoratam, to teach them. And the Rabbi and the Talmud, the Gemara and Brachos comments and says there's 5 things over here which the pasuk is referring to, and that is Luchot Even, pretty straightforward. What is the luchos that we talk about? The Aseres HaDibros, the 10 Commandments. Torah, what is Torah? Mikra, the written law. Mitzvah is the Mishnah, the oral tradition, the oral transmission. Asher Katavti, Nevi'im and Ketuvim, the prophets and the writings. Tanakh, essentially. Lahoratam, to teach them. What is that referring to? Gemara, which is the explanation behind the mitzvah, explanation behind the law. Now, this is really something fundamental which people don't always think about. And I actually got asked this question by a kid once. Can I mute this fellow over here? There we go. The question is the following: if what Moshe, and we think about Moshe receiving the Torah on Har Sinai, we think of it as being the very same scroll that we have in the Aron Kodesh. Think of Torah, the stories, the mitzvot, everything that's inside there. Now that can't be. Why? Well, because many of those stories, number one, didn't even happen yet, which, okay, you can say, well, there was a prophecy about them. But number two, you're going to take Moshe for a fool, because if that's what he receives, then he learns all about the mistakes he's going to make. He reads about the fact that he's going to hit the rock. What does he do? He goes and hits the rock. He reads about the story of the spies, sees how terrible it's going to be for the Jewish people, sees the punishments they get. What does he do? He goes and sends out the spies. I mean, that's just 2 examples of what can't be. And therefore, what we talk about when we say that Moshe receives the Torah on Har Sinai is not the stories. Those all got written down before Moshe passes away. And that's the Sefer Torah that we are referring that we have, and that's the Sefer Torah we've had for thousands of years. Torah is the law. Torah is the mitzvot. Torah are the guidance to life that he receives on Har Sinai. The 613 commandments with all of their intricacies and their understandings of them. And that's what he transmits, not the writings themselves. And the same is true when it says the Tanakh, the Nevi'im and the Ketuvim. Again, these are all stories that haven't happened yet. But what it is the messages from them, the lessons to be learned from them, the ideas, all of that Moshe receives. But here's the question. This is what we're going to spend just a few minutes talking about. And that is, well, how much did he receive on Har Sinai? Did he receive absolutely everything, every single detail that we could possibly know of when it comes to the Torah received on Har Sinai? Or perhaps it's a bit more nuanced. And therefore, let's just talk about two times, well, there's a number of times the Gemara, the Medrash talks about this, but it's interesting. So, first one is the Gemara Megillah, and it says, Amar Rabbi Barabba said, "My dichsiv." What does it mean in the pasuk? This pasuk is in Devarim. Va'alehem kachol hadvarim asher diber Hashem imachem bahar. With all of the things which Hashem spoke to you on the mountain. Melamed, this comes to teach us. Sheherah HaKadosh Baruch Hu Moshe. Hashem shows Moshe dikdukei Torah, the details of the Torah, dikdukei sofrim, the details of the rabbinic law as well. Umasha hasofrim asidin lechadish, and even that which the sages are going to come up with themselves. Umaynihu, and what is an example of that? Mikra Megillah. So even Megillah, which of course the Purim story hadn't happened yet, but the concept of Megillah was something which Moshe knew about himself. Okay, we're gonna think about this. Well, I'm gonna just read something else as well and kind of contrast these two Gemaras or the Medrash. Amar Rabbi says this is a Medrash in Kitisa. So we just spoke about a Gemara in Megillah, which seems to indicate that Moshe receives absolutely everything on Har Sinai, even the Dikdukei Sofrim, even the rabbinic laws, which were only, shared with the Jewish people much later. Kol Arboim Yom, all 40 days that Moshe is on the mountain, he learned Torah and he forgot it. Lamad Torah b'Shachar, he learned and he forgot. Every day, 40 days, he's learning, he's forgetting. He's learning, he's forgetting. Amalei eventually turns to Hashem, turns to Rabbanu Olam. Yesh li Arboim Yom, I have 40 days. Ve'eni Yodea Davar, and I'm not getting it. I just can't possibly retain all this information. Ma'asa Kadosh Baruch Hu, what did Hashem do? What did God do? Misha Hishlam Arboim Yom, when the 40 days were up, Natan lo Kadosh Baruch Hu, Natan lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God gives et HaTorah, the Torah to Moshe, Matana, as a gift. Shenemar v'yitena Moshe, he gives it to Moshe. So although Moshe is trying to learn it, trying to understand it on his own accord, he's struggling, he can't do it, he's forgetting it, every day he's forgetting it. Hashem says, you know what? I'm going to take a USB stick, put it in your brain, and it's given to you as opposed to you having to remember the information. Now, this is where the Medrash asks the following question and says, how is this possible? Kol HaTorah Lamad Moshe? Is it possible that Moshe learned all of Torah? It would seem, when it says he's learning every single day for 40 days, he's learning all of the Torah that we call Torah. But it says, the Medrash asks, Katuv Torah, it's written in the Torah, this is a verse in Eov, in Job, Aruka me eretz mida. It is as vast as the land, Rechava min hayam, and as wide as the seas. It's infinite. The wisdom of the Torah is infinite. It's never ending. It's endless. You can never actually say that you've learned everything because there's always more to understand. There's always more to learn. There's always more knowledge had. So how is it possible that Moshe learned everything? It's not a finite. There's nothing finite about the wisdom of the Torah, which one could possibly say, I've learned everything. And therefore the Medrash says, Ella. What must it be? Klalim lamdu HaKadosh Baruch Hu Moshe. It was principles that Hashem taught Moshe. And that's what the verse means when it says, it takes that word kechaloto and uses it as the word klal, which means principles. What the Medrash is teaching us over here is that when we think about Moshe receiving everything on Har Sinai, which is often what we hear, it doesn't mean that all the details themselves are shared with Moshe, or I would say the applications of the laws were all shared with Moshe. If anyone's learned Gemara, you'll see the Gemara is full of applications of laws. What would be when this happens? What would be when that happens? What would be when those two are together? Full of applications. Was it necessarily the applications themselves that he was learning? That's vast. I mean, that's infinite. There's always more applications you can come up with. No, it's telling its principles, which means that Moshe, who we get our Messiah from, learn absolutely everything from Hashem in terms of all you need to know anything. So he learned the principles, the formula that you'd need to come to a halachic conclusion around what the Torah really wants and what the law is. But did he learn absolutely everything in terms of the applications of it? No. I don't know. Just an example I was thinking of was, of course, he learned the laws of Shabbat. He learned about the malachot of Shabbat, the 39 malachot, one of the malachot being cooking. Cooking is wrong on Shabbat. Well, did Moshe have to know what a microwave was? Did Moshe learn about microwaving on Shabbat? Probably not, right? Microwaves weren't invented yet. But he knew enough that if you'd present him with a microwave and you explain to him how a microwave works, that he'd be able to come to the conclusion of the fact that it's wrong to microwave on Shabbat because that's included in cooking. So that's an application of the law. But the law itself was clear and it was understood and something which he passed on and something which we have only as a result of Moshe. And there's a really interesting Gemara which kind of sums all of this up. And I wanted to read this story to you again. Kind of, you might know the story already, but it's a story which really gives understanding to this concept. Before doing so, by the way, it'll be interesting to share the Tosfos Yontif. Anyone who's ever been to Krakow would have come across his grave, potentially lived in Krakow, he wrote the famous Pirush Tosfos Yontif on Mishnayos, and he says an interesting idea. He says, although Moshe receives everything, as we mentioned in the Gemara Megillah, he knew even about what the Chazal, what the rabbis were going to institute in terms of the mitzvah of Megillah. That's not necessarily something which he transmitted as part of the Messiah of Torah, as part of the transmission of Torah. So he could have known that. That could have something which he knew, the Ruach HaKodesh, he knew that with the prophecy about it. But in terms of whether that's something which he actually passed on as the Messiah of Torah, not necessarily. And therefore, what he says is, and he picks up on the language of the Gemara Megillah, and we said before, Herahu HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hashem shows him even that which Chazal are going to make in terms of the halacha. He shows him. He doesn't pass it over to him as Torah, but he shows him. Meaning he sees what's going to happen in the future in terms of the mitzvot. But that's not necessarily something which he's told to then pass on to Yeshua as the Messiah of Torah. Just an interesting thing to share. But this is the story I wanted to tell over. And that is the story in the Gemara Menachos shares the following story. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Rav. Rabbi Yehuda says the name of Rav. B'shah she'ala Moshe l'maram. When Moses goes up the mountain, Matzah HaKadosh Baruch Hu, he finds Hashem, he finds God. Sheyoshev, he's sitting. Again, this is all metaphoric. Hashem doesn't have a body, so it doesn't sit, but it's meant to teach us something over here. V'kosher ketarim lo'osios, and he's tying crowns to the letters. Hashem is involved in the Torah over here. Omar Lefanov, and he says to him, Rabboni Shalom, Mi ma'akev al yadcha. Who is it that? Well, I'm not going to translate that so much because it's a technicality over here. Anyway, Hashem continues and says, Omar Le, Hashem says to him, this is the main point. Adam Echad, there is one man, Yesh, she'atid liyot b'sof kamadoros, who is going to live in many years to come. But Akiva ben Yosef Shema, his name is Akiva ben Yosef, she'atid lidrosh, he is going to darshan, he is going to expound on every kotz on every single kots, tilin shal halachos. The kots is those little crowns, those little horns almost that you see on the letters of the Torah. Akiva ben Yosef, he said he understands exactly why each letter needs every single crown, and he's going to share tilin shal halachos, heaps, mounds of halachos, which you can learn from him. Now Moshe is fascinated by this, and he says, Omar Lefanov, and he says, Rabboni Shalom, Harehu li, can you show him to me? I want to see what this fellow is all about. Sounds interesting. Omar Loi says to him, Chazor la'acharecha, turn around. Alach v'yoshav b'sof shmona shurot. He goes and sits, kind of gets transported into a class over here, and he's sitting in a class that Rabbi Akiva is giving. He's sitting in Rabbi Akiva's lecture, and he's sitting on the 8th row back, whatever that represents. And he's sitting there, and he's listening to Rabbi Akiva talking. V'loy haya yodea mahen omrim. he could not understand what was going on. He just didn't understand the lecture. It didn't mean anything to him. He was hearing what Rabbi Akiva was saying, but the concepts just weren't familiar. He wasn't familiar with those concepts. Toshash kocha, and he not feeling very good about himself. Given shegia l'davar echad, eventually at some point in the class, in the lecture, one of the students puts up his hand and says to him, Minayin, Rabbi, our teacher, Minayin, lacha, how do you know this? Where does this come from? And he says, Omar lahen, he says that the student, he says, halacha l'Moshe Sinai. This is a halacha which Moshe received on Har Sinai, and there's been a tradition about this halacha, all about myself. So what I'm sharing with you is something that Moshe received on Har Sinai, Nisyashva Datoi, and then Moshe again feels good about himself and doesn't feel as doesn't lose hope in the way that he did before. Now, if you just look at that story, it doesn't seem to make sense. He doesn't understand what's going on. He doesn't seem to understand the concept Rabbi Akiva is sharing. Yet, at the end of the class, Rabbi Akiva says, well, this is something which I received from Moshe. Did Moshe receive it or did he not? Is this something Moshe knew or something Moshe didn't know? If Moshe received on Har Sinai, then why is he not understanding it? Well, given what we've discussed earlier, this would give some understanding to this story. Moshe receives absolutely everything. Moshe receives the principles. He receives all you need to know in order to understand anything the Torah is trying to teach us. Did the details around that get shared with Moshe? Did the applications around that get shared with Moshe? Did Moshe go into every single detail of every single principle that was shared? Not necessarily. And therefore, you have over here is a principle which Moshe himself receives, which Moshe passes on to Yeshua, which Yeshua passes on to all the future generations, and that is the transmission of Torah. Rabbi Akiva takes that principle and develops it. Rabbi Akiva takes that principle and uses it to understand more. It comes to new applications and new understandings and new ideas. So, yes, it comes from Moshe. Yes, it's something Moshe shares, but there is more that the Rabbi Akiva has done with that in terms of finding a deeper understanding, a deeper meaning, and applying something new to it. And that's just a fundamental which I thought would be nice to share what we mean when it comes to the transmission of Torah that Moshe received. When we talk about Moshe receiving everything on Har Sinai, it's all the principles that the Torah is sharing with us. But in terms of the infinite nature of Torah, that is something which, as the Medrash tells us, Moshe couldn't have possibly learnt everything because there was always more to understand and always more applications to be had. And therefore, when we study Torah, we're always learning new ideas, we're always learning more. So keep on studying, keep on learning. You're never going to learn it all. There's always more to be learned, and good luck on that journey. Thank you very much for having me.
You say that if Moshe Rabbeinu came, you have a clue what we're doing.
Might find it too simple.
Black hats and long beards and
Sorry? Especially the USB.
okay, I'll see you now to and speak about